And we are about to have our, for this event, Keynote, a longer presentation. I'm also discussing it because it's like our others. But Ben Sweeting, who's going to give the keynote, is quite a special, this broader design and so he has to say that venues, and we thought present his thinking on problems, tame and wicked, both of them, and the processes that to this event. Ben is active in academic communities that to these topics. He can speak from many viewpoints and from discussions he has had in many communities. He's a principal lecturer, architecture, technology of Brighton. Thank you, Ben, for putting that on your title slide. Very convenient for me. Which is more interesting, he's in other, well, communities. One of them is American Society for Cybernetics. Another one is the Systemic Design Association. And he hosted a very big event there last year in 2020. 11 conference, which was very big. And some of you may have read the contributions. They are freely accessible online, very active in this open access community. So I think there's a really great, in many of the things, the thinking, not only to, but also to make thoughts. And I think with his seen in the audience, like and from methodologies research group. Esoteric, but it's actually a really interesting breeding ground for discussing tame and wicked problems for different may lead to and I think this is what we hear more about. Without more further ado, thank you very much for coming, thinking with us today.
Thanks, Tom. Well, hi, everyone. So my name is Ben, and invitation to join. And as Candy was saying, I work on the south coast of England in architecture programs and design programs, and I'm part of a research group on radical methodologies, reference to the foundations, and we're interested in the foundation about research, how they get done. And this is a topic that I think Wicked Problems speaks to, and we'll hopefully show that today. Wicked Problems really resonates with me. Found it, and I've always been in situations that have no right answers. So one of their characters, how to respond to that. And when I think of no right answers, in a practical sense, and I think Wicked Problems is one way to think about both of those contexts together. What I'm going to present today is an ongoing effort understanding of Wicked Problem to take into account the differences between today's contexts and the context of the 1960s. Rittel responding to. I began working on a few years ago with an event called Wicked Possibilities, which is organized by Stanley Sutherland and Tom A. It also featured Tom Fisher, Matilda Tam, and Paul. all of whom are influential on what I'll present today. This have been conversations at different times with a colleague of mine called Marie Davidova and another colleague of mine, Queenie Clark. What I'll present is very much interested in questions. I'm also grateful for your patience where my arguments are not quite as funny as they might be yet. The idea I want to get across is that wickedness is not itself a problem. It's been mistaken for one. Plain distinction from the wicked, the sort of typical concern with it, full examination of the tame. And I don't mean things that we treat as wicked. I mean, whereas Rittel's call to move attention from the tame, I think today's challenges require both sides of the distinction and the interplay and movement between the two. I'm going to the first meant when someone wicked problem, and this is a distinct meant. Right? Second, I'm going to sketch out a form of so I try to move the focus on what wickedness is like, what characteristics it has, and how to act in those situations to sort of. And in that, I draw on some ideas from the discourse of cybernetics, a field that Rittel referred to, and which has a number of other commonalities. I won't go into them, but some of you for underlying references as I go through. Third, sort of process that can produce attention to produces tameness. So we spoke to this a little bit earlier on in the previous. I'll try and bring parallels with another adjacent body of theory, so another something I think closely related Rittel's work of the philosopher of science Paul K. Feyerabend, who was Rittel's colleague at UC Berkeley. There is to highlight that many are thought of as tamed problems that have been. And then I'll move from the part where I'll make a critique and suggest a possible counter process to that, which I use the placeholder untaming the space for. Will be that many tame problems are only because they have problems. Not necessarily just, necessarily sensible, and the whole metaphor of taming is often inappropriate. The prior acts of taming, so the one things that we experience as tame and so hard to engage. Design practices have the potential critical role with respect to, in addition to their orientation. So I begin. What is meant by wicked? So as the terminology of wicked and tame becomes integrated, it's important to one calls a problem wicked. This is a different question from what Rittel intended by this term. To see a systems idea entering, but on this can easily become buzzwords. So, but here is a university hiring. It's using wicked problems, a bit like Grand Challenge, and it's seeking some things. Makes it difficult to be comprehensive about how the term is used. So what I'm going to do is run through 3 of the most common ones, and I'm then going way of thinking about wicked and different possibilities or different connections. Meant by calling problem is that the problem, so that is equivalent or used as an indication of prestige. No one ever claims to work on tame problems, right? Everyone is addressing the wicked ones. Tame problems, people who are from whichever discipline in, right? It's me, the speaker, who is you call for the wicked problems. The tame problems are dealt with the discipline. Wicked problems can also or limited ambition, addressing something, or for why plans didn't work out as they were intended. This is, this is the best that can be done. Couldn't possibly have foreseen Y and Z. While wicked problems are difficulties, the assumption that wicked problems are more difficult than tame problems doesn't make sense in a number of my way example of tame problems, rocket science, right? That it's wicked problems is a reaction directly to missions and the application inside problems. So Rittel's seminar that Churchman refers to in 1967 is part of a where Churchman was how insights from that to problems like urban design. Journeying to the moon is not easy, but it does have, it can be approached in a procedural way as a project. Compare NASA missions to a university. It's much easier to organize a university. Anyone can organize a university. It doesn't specialists in management, their academic discipline, and progressed into that role. Little consensus on how university should be organized. So there's unclear goals within that situation. Another example, problems are also commonplace that designers encounter. So that's not to say that all design problems are wicked. They're encounter, but problem characteristics are not really a surprise if you're a and there are the articulate deeply that we still refer to this. Perhaps that we encounter statistics of wicked problems in many everyday situations. There's this lovely quote I found from Rittel as well. How is it that we can get to the moon? Right? Interesting things about thinking about wicked and tame is there's some very straightforward things that cannot be approached in some points to, I think, is that types of difficulty rather than levels of difficulty. So hierarchy of complexity or a high challenge, but different types or different of challenge. These different types. So that brings us to the second one we talked about, which is domains. So different, roughly corresponding to distinction between the domain of science and technology on the one hand, and political on the other. That's the original context and the sort of method of science and technology. So mass emissions, for instance, in the context of planning. So all the wicked problem characteristics are those sorts of methods in certain sorts of social situations. And this distinction form a kind of defensive role in design as part of regulation by science. Design has become invaded or encroached on by science or scientific ideas of scientific method, often by designers' ideas of scientific method. But there are limitations to scientific and technical methods beyond their own contexts, and this requires and this is another reason why the useful from science and technology today. The idea of differentiating the technical and the tame made a lot of sense in the 1970s. It's neither feasible nor desirable to treat these domains separately or independently today. Technologies are entangled with politics, they're entangled with relations, with justice. Recent themselves manifest the sort we more commonly associated with social complexity. So it's becoming, technologies that change how they work, use them, right? So as we use them, they relate to us later to the idea that distinction between the wicked and tame, and a mapping of that to a binary distinction between the scientific, technical, and the suspiciously neat. So that idea of is to see the tame as a subset of the wicked, which Tom brought up earlier. So this is the idea that boundary judgments and broader wicked problem situations. Problems involved in designing exist within a set of wicked contexts, such as public health. There are tame questions that present particular types of defining the system as part of broader sets of interrelated systems, and one might ask what project, however well, was answering the right question. Problems of problem framing surrounding the tame problems. What I want to emphasize is in this way of looking at it, distinction between tame and wicked, of what and who gets included and excluded from consideration. However, necessarily the case of the lower frame than the wicked, subset of the wicked. I think if you keep to the idea of corresponding to different domains, that the technical is embedded within the social, etc. You kind of loosen up important in today's contexts, then a larger framing could application. Consider, for instance, the NASA missions. If one expands the boundaries of the framing from the engineering project, then that apparently well-defined engineering, social and political transformation, politics of the Cold War, and can be formulated in a variety of ways. The sort of insides of and you focus on this within the context of the NASA missions, and things start to look much, and as Tom Fisher has asked, look like, from the engineering projects, they proceeded through chance, error, accident, and these parts of the process tend to become obscure So failure is not an option that makes it harder to see problem type tame processes depend. Up just that first section, the wicked and the tame, as I see it, are types of difficulty, not these types can be related to social context versus technical, but it makes less sense in the 1970s. Tame relate closely to problem framing. It's not nested within the wicked. What may this is a sort of neglected question. Rittel doesn't really address this. The Buchanan addresses it by talking about design as being kind of, but discussions of the wicked problems focus on their characteristics, little as a given. The wicked tame distinction is not simply about a distinction on the one hand and planning on the other. How should we think about it? One way of doing is via cybernetics, a field where the boundaries and different embodiments of when the focus is much more on processes and dynamics rather than what those processes and dynamics are in. Cybernetics was an influence whose earlier work often referenced requisite variety, Ross Ashby. As Ashby's notion of requisite variety is the idea that for one system to fully regulate its relations with other, it needs at least those other systems to respond to variation, trying to regulate its own relations with at least as much variety as towards it. Rittel applies context like environmental design. This is in Rittel's seminars in the 60s. So the designer needs to anticipate and respond to variable varieties in the environment. So building respond to potential varieties with variety of their own as a designer to prevent that variety. There's an idea of excluding. That is, one needs to do things in design that respond to and counter the possibility of unwanted states in the app. Notice in that of which states are unwanted for whom. Question on the table. Planning situations exceed the variety of the planner by many orders of magnitude. Trying, so what Rittel is, can end up being reductive of the possible variety of what is planned, reduced to what the planner control. Requisite variety, Rittel's call to make planning participative, so to involve stakeholders in the expand the agency of state. This is a way of increasing. So the stakeholders are moving from being regulated by planning to being also part of the regulation. The idea of a symmetry of expertise as a symmetry of variety. And this this allows for a kind of self-regulation. So rather than the kind of regulation towards variety, so rather than that expertise variety to what is controlled. Rittel spoke problems. So in a way that implies a sense of agreement, so agreement amongst those concerned, and also the need to engage with those questions. Looked at from the wickedness is interaction. The basic metaphor for this is this, which is okay in this adventure in Alice, which you may be familiar with, and this is from, and here pardon me, a strange scenario where she's playing a game of croquet, which is a strange enough game as it is, and instead of a mallet, everyone is playing with, and instead of a ball, everyone is trying to hit. The hedgehogs kind of uncurl and walk away. The their head out of the way just when twist Alice, the moving over to make the hoops, and they kind of run around as well. And the whole thing, there's a character called shouting and trying to indeed. Slightly, so this is Bateson. It's one of the Metalog 50s. It's republished of Mind around the same time as paper. A series of dialogues that Tony Bateson developed with his daughter Mary Catherine Bateson, and here they're talking about this example, and did everything have to be alive, be muddled? And Bateson is Gregory Bateson's initially responding, no, in this, and no, actually that is central. So this little discussion focuses on learning. The pieces are alive, then expect that learning would help coordinate the situation, but it's actually what makes the situation. So there's not just learning about learning, so learning in the context of the learning that's going on, about others learning, so it's not about everything, because others have you learn about their agenda and vice versa, and about the situation to make it predictable. You are actually the flamingo is and maybe trying to as Alice learns about the flamingo maybe learns how to. As an example, a kind of dynamic learning about the system to increase one's own variety, whichever applying to every plot, potentially in the system. So from this perspective, if you can change in relation to the situation with more variety, changing, right, including how it how the situation changes, how it responds to how you change, then its variety, however complex, can eventually, and it can be experienced as tame. At least some problems are in, others are tame only because they're or has been reduced. Like the mass emissions has that it's possible to reduce the processes. On the other hand, if the to your changes faster than you can respond to it, so if your attempts to increase your own variety to learn a prompt increases of variety, you can increase your own, it's going to be experienced as wicked, whatever you do. It has the potential for a runaway, where attempts to increase one's own learning. Anyway, out of that would be the kind of idea of resolution Rittel spoke of. Rittel and Weber say that one cannot build a free way to see how it works, interpreted as being about the process. So that the dynamic means that the situation by change the whole situation, and then even if you take the freeway away again, you've changed the situation. You can never undo the consequence. I think it's possible to trace all of the to this sort of dynamic. And there might be other kinds of dynamics that produce them too, but here's one. So the NASA moon landings, landing on the moon is not changed much by attempts to land on it. Land on the moon doesn't, for instance. Wanted variety can be removed so that the rockets work in predictable ways eventually. Variety of the task is immense, to actually reeled in or called system. The experiment is tame. The variety of the experimental situation is carefully controlled. By contrast, even rumors of a university reorganization have come within the organization the university operates. Analyze the situation or do a survey to because doing so creates which would then need further analysis. Notice also how experienced as wicked or tame from the depend on one's agency in the situation. So from a different perspective, the problem is the game of croquet is different for the hedgehogs compared to the flamingos. It is outside of the game, the wickedness is not the problem. I think wickedness here is of value as a potential way of the croquet game. There's an ethical value in the wickedness dynamic in resisting the authority and oppressiveness of the. So we talked a little tame problems being the previous resolutions to wicked problems, and what I tried to give a characterization of that, and I will call these D on the end. So I'm going to use to think about the dynamics of and to do this in recent body of work, that of philosopher of science Paul K. Feyerabend. To what extent Feyerabend knew each other's work between them. They're both faculty at UC Berkeley at the same time. Ideas. So Feyerabend 58, Rittel in 1963. With the work of Karl Popper. Feyerabend began. Popper was a supporter of Feyerabend, put him into various jobs, and Feyerabend was a supporter of Popper. But Feyerabend would go on to be a fierce critic of Popper's position. A sense that Rittel's the Wicked and the Tame is a idealized form of method represented by Popper's. According to the term wicked problem is borrowed from Popper. If anyone has a reference for exactly where, I'd love help with. Popper is represented a form of scientific method, appropriate only for tame problem. The idea of falsification, referenced in the 10th characteristics of wicked problems, the idea that the planner has no right to be wrong. Feyerabend did make systems. Rittel also, in both the one with Weber and also the 19th, Rittel refers to the 1973 paper, and in 1972, Rittel has "everything goes," catchphrase that Feyerabend had begun to use from around 19, and which Feyerabend is very seeing scientific method, kind of anything goes activity. Second. So Rittel is defending design and planning from inappropriate applications of science or scientific. Feyerabend is engaged in a parallel defense of, so from idealization on its own success. Just a passage, one of Feyerabend's 70s, Science and a Free Society, which could almost be written by Rittel. Of the way that social problems through expertise, the politicians talk to each other. They don't really in his business. The problem is expect other people to adapt to them. Really at the Feyerabend as well as Rittel. Feyerabend has often been suggesting that any method is as good as any other method. Sort of reaction to Feyerabend and Feyerabend's of his work, and thought that a dose of good. So Feyerabend refers to or refers to a position or characterizes as logical anarchism, but he talks about you know, the state, an ideal forever state, but as a specific medicine for that a dose of anarchy. Anything goes for Feyerabend is the question that so that the question that it answers, like a method, possible cases that you can, then the only one is anything goes. In other words, there's no that is applicable in all contexts. That science develops this by arguing that science's greatest triumph, the ideal successes of the American Revolution, conform to idealized versions of the scientific method, and that following methodological ideas would restrict science. Argument is not against science per se, it's that scientific method does not have priority in and of itself, justification through other means. Specific points I'd want to draw out from Feyerabend in relationship to The first is the method cannot be defined in advance. So aspect, I think in this moment in science, use the kind of dynamic that I suggested earlier, talking about variety. So, and as yet unknown surroundings, measuring in advance of encountering those surroundings. So in science, to creating new, creating new conditions to respond to, that new these, the idea of wickedness rooted in variety, and also suggests a planning. Not fully analyze the whole situation in advance, because design and planning create new need to be analyzed. So you can take from that is that while we often see design as a response to wicked problems, one might eat them. So being a root because of the way it introduces variety in the way that design acts. And as design is inherently human, wickedness. Okay, so that's the first part. And prevails or is prevailing not because of its own merits, but because science prevails because in its favor. As you can see, these are instances of it with other ways of knowing or other forms of science are made in. So seems like science rational and objective because though judging its merits within its own sets of standards. And Feyerabend's civilian oversight of these processes. The tameness of science, prior resolutions that are, and the continued consent to these resolutions have been just one. Problems may be inevitably tame. Many tame problems might be regarded as having been. They could have been, right? So current rigorous science that was possible. It is difficult to engage these prior acts of taming because your neutrality conceal these processes. Activity is produced, that's that it requires action, that thing to take comparison is like participation in planning. Feyerabend proposed the need for political legitimization of expertise, democratic oversight, scientific experts. While it's possible to be optimistic in the 1970s, seeking political legitimacy is open to manipulation. The capital, corporation, theories, and so on. Also, participatory approaches to design and planning are not as leveling as one would hope they are. They tend to privilege the privilege most able to participate in those processes. Response to this is the of Sandra Harding, who refers to this as a kind of strong objectivity. This in the philosophy of science, avoids being characterized as and instead frames an intensified focus on the standpoint as a stronger. So one understands more about a situation by working from the standpoints of those less. So a game or to the university, whose perspectives reveal more about the situation. People with more power or agency. Wickedness is related to the new, and so to design, and so wickedness is not itself a problem. Many tame problems might be better tamed, as tame as an example. It rests on already established framings that could potentially have been resolved in other ways. The resolutions that to those tamings and uncritical and unjust by reducing ways of knowing. Statistics are often thought of as describing sorts of idealized forms of sciences are inapplicable, that at least some of those dynamics science's own foundations. So the last section, I turn now to the idea and the dynamic of taming problems. The idea of taming is introduced in the 1967 discussion of Rittel's seminar, and Churchman notes various forms of partial or superficial taming that are not to be emulated. So taming is introduced, really a good idea. Of good feeling, stealing, leaving someone else to nevertheless, taming is picked up by other authors. Use this to avoid overemphasizing their to manage expectations, to recognize the tentativeness of what they're doing. Yet Rittel is incrementalism, incremental improvements. One of the things Rittel warns us in the symptoms, the of underlying problems more powerful, reinforce them and make them harder to change. And as such, present concerns in terms of familiar concepts from other domains. So humans make them behave predictably in contexts. That Rittel and Weber taming a lion could be a matter of training, such as in a circus, or through designed infrastructure that misses for humans, such as a. There are superficial similar lions nor social design linear problem solving, and both may have significant consequences for. In turn, the that wickedness is something to be controlled or made predictable, a reduction of its variety. Is appropriate aspiration, iron or for a city. Consider again the croquet game from Alice in Wonderland. Taming would involve removing the, for instance, through threat or through technology, so through the replacement of gun labor. Many things that are taken for granted have been tamed in such a manner. The dominance of Western science is a reduction in the variety of knowing inventions. Reducing variety in order to optimize yields, again for humans. Floodplains are tamed, reducing variety to make them more predictable for human activities. By building rivers. In social settings, tacit conventions about how to. The wicked tamed problems is not necessarily revealed by reframing them in larger contexts. The problem is embedded within a bit. Wickedness is not about the larger interactions of the whole of hidden within the tame problem. So what would the opposite of taming be? What would it mean to untame a problem? So if taming a situation is the reduction or the reeling in of, untaming it would be a letting go of control to the point of runaway, but an expansion of its variety and possibilities. The problems in designing and planning through or negotiating the situation may contain or may tame or tamed problems. For instance, the question of how to resolve the climate problem, that it is produced assumptions about economics, lifestyle, food, technology, and so on that seem inevitable or conventional texts. Tame or tame parts for granted and to end complexity resulting from them between them. Already been removed or hidden. Are there not all assumptions underlying tamed problems can be interrogated in order to create new possibilities? Review what seem like this is rearrange everything as it could also just be to reaffirm some assumption. Even makes a difference. Planning, management, age with wicked problems, all seem ways of working that have the capacity to challenge foundational assumptions. But often they don't do this. The emergency of, the immediacy of action, of that, the limit of a project, by co-option, by interest, the professionals. All the more reason then to question the foundations, because otherwise to bring change may end up repeating the same errors. The wicked and tame problems is a call to address complexity pragmatically by working it through an ongoing process. It's a call not just towards this complexity, but also a call to re-examine basic assumptions. Answered questions that do not even seem like they are questions, and to so for instance, the core contain all sorts of faulty assumptions that are often unchallenged in design. The ethical actions are not necessarily ethically good. Expertise that presents its objective occupies only possible ones. Things are done and not necessarily do things.
You missed an applause on our end. Sorry. Been examination of especially the potentials of tame, and I think it's really, really great to see you moving the field ahead, actually, because after 50 years of discussion, and we should be having them many different fields, not only design. I'm very happy also that we have in our design people, but also people, so we can add to these discussions. I would like to ask for Ben. Ben is very like all your questions and very interesting discussion. So I hope that you all had a good coffee and ready to a bit more interesting. Please feel free to unmute your mic. We are on one mic here.
Good morning,
Yes,
good afternoon, whatever time of day it is for you. We use all sorts of parallels that I see that are, will, I'm sure, continue the conversation. We use the idea you were talking about, and I think what you know, that is available to us to tame a problem, and how that they're balancing or leveling act about clarify a problem as wicked or tame. Am I understanding? Can you maybe clarify?
So I guess so start here. So thinking of wicked context of an idea of regulation, so as a kind of dynamic rather than as fixed properties of a situation. Has a lot of variety with that doesn't necessarily make it mass emission being the and is that the attempt to learn about how to intervene or to progress in that situation. There are some my attempts to grapple with them in the situation, then I can produce. So for instance, if I plan a city, my attempts to a survey or something over here, something over there, it's going to produce more variety that I'm never going to catch. As in a kind of situation, my team's increase of its own variety can kind of eventually catch up. Like maybe it takes a really long. So I'm suggesting. So that's a kind of way of locating the idea whether can kind of reel in the variety of regulation, or attempts to regulate end up prompting more variation. And then I think that Rittel's talking about resolution, the variety by meeting and a more even thinking about it, but also coming to a resolution mean that everything is regulated. So you could, so Rittel in the earlier work, designer has to anticipate happen. The variety user to experience would not be the full variety that the designer would anticipate, because the collapsing. So situation have their agent a kind of full of variety of possibilities, then they then resolve to make their. So that's a sort of different process from his model of reducing things unilaterally.
I would like to talk about this forever. Just to jump into, you were talking about this technical and scientific on the one hand, and the social on the other. How we could different approaches to that separation in the 1970s versus now. And I think you used the word appropriate then is not appropriate now. That notion of appropriateness can be different interpreted to observe and see what's your. It would be wrong to world was easy and now complicated, and therefore we are looking at a different. I think you can go 1930s and look modern times, and even further, I think ways to point back to how humans, societies have been technocratic oppression. What has changed since is a different sort of awareness, maybe discourse that makes it harder to get away with certain things, and with the internet, maybe even publicity that makes it. The technocratic oppression is more constant than you in what you say.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that. I think what I to mean is maybe more of ideas rather than within like what was a good idea. The 90s and 60s within the ideas of plans is a kind of technical expertise model, way that thinkers in those disciplines moved out of that was to a human-centered, participant idea, which I think would have seen at the time, and it's taken a long time to the injustices in it's why participative models are in potentially in unjust or is not objective. So objective is produced, and that's creates a confusion of participative modes of is enabling people to, and so this is another kind of tangle time to work through, but of course it would have still existed then. And yeah, so I guess when I think the maybe viable was better than appropriate as a word then. I think that's one to draw. Very and lots of people would discuss wicked problems because they and that's a Rittel is misunderstood and so on, but it seems like this has to if the concept is, I think, shifting it to focus more on what the dynamics are is
and maybe that I agree, or maybe we might have come to an agreement. You idea of what's with looking at wicked and tame, and I think we conflated two different perspectives, but I maybe, and I'm so committed to the idea that tame problems are a subset. I have a worldview according to which the universe and we clean in it all seem to have the worldview that the universe is orderly, still needs some cleaning up. And the taming within a messy universe, and quite committed to this idea. Problems being wicked problems. what you just seem to look at the whole thing you refer to when you say wickedness within tame, that seem to look at maybe what you did with life support system that is ship that is forms a part of a mission. So that kind of is probably different or independent. The taming and cleaning up of procedural and formal, problem solving strategy. Are two different things. The case of ideas within which we think and go about area and so forth, and looking at systems being nested. I'm sure if that makes sense, but
I think it was I think I like the way you put it, that I looked at it sideways. That was
it seems you are wrong in it, but
it was a different in a different plane. Yeah, so the and this is one of the parts not fully, I don't feel yet, but I think if a tame problem is a sub problem, could be meant in several ways. It could be that it, I do a particular that framing, then
guess
framings.
Yeah, I guess what I'm doing is a so weird of the world through these, and then once you have that contract established, it becomes very hard to carving out these systemic nest doesn't quite see to that. But maybe I'm getting lost in the detail. Maybe this is something.
I think it's an interesting work through. It'll maybe but part of my thing relates to whole relations being hierarchical rather than a hierarchical or holarchical. That are wholes are parts of different wholes, and that just as wholes that are not exhibited, parts which are whole, not subtractions from the wholes of which they're part. So really, so I can't essentially in both. And I think the way that obviously the way what one could describe example I used from your as there's the kind of bigger world of explanation is the individual explorations and the political. But I think that as I want to move away from kind of identifying social and wicked, then with the wicked and tame with the, then it kind of there's more than one way to talk about what is, and I think identifying the way the wicked or the or maybe even survives nested within another be described as tame, that this kind of allowed kind of revealed or discovered. It's a slightly, I just tried to move it and so I guess I'm more that I want to kind of deploy that idea. Yeah, I 3 versions of it.
Slightly running over time. Took a while to explain his thoughts, and then we really wanted to engage. So